A bloodstained child crashes through a crime boss's fortress with a plea that will pierce the armor of Seoul's most untouchable man. In the velvet shadows of a private Gangnam lounge, Seo Tae-hwan sits like a mountain, Seoul's most feared syndicate boss conducting business with surgical precision, until the heavy doors explode open. A small girl in a torn pink dress, face streaked with blood and tears, breaks every sacred rule of the underworld. She runs past frozen guards and grabs his tattooed arm, begging him to save her mother from the men who are killing her. The room goes silent. In a world where emotion is suicide, Tae-hwan faces an impossible moment. Protect the cold walls he built after losing everything, or answer the desperate cry of a child who sees something in him no one else has dared to believe still exists. What happens next will reveal whether Seoul's Dragon of Gangnam has any soul left to save. Before the story begins, take a second to like and subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next. The city knew his name the way children know monsters in the dark. Whispered, feared, never spoken above a breath. Seo Tae-hwan, the Dragon of Gangnam. A man who could end careers with a phone call, erase debts with a nod, or silence problems with a single word that no one dared to question. His empire stretched across Seoul like a spider's web, invisible but inescapable. Luxury hotels paid him protection. High-rise construction projects moved forward only with his approval. Even the police knew better than to dig too deep into certain neighborhoods where his influence ran thicker than blood through veins. He didn't rule through chaos or theatrics. Tae-hwan was a surgeon, not a butcher. Every move calculated. Every decision measured. Every emotion locked away where it couldn't be weaponized against him. The Azure Lotus Lounge sat on the 40th floor of a glass tower overlooking the Han River. A place where deals worth millions were sealed over aged whiskey, and the city lights glittered like fallen stars below. No one entered without an invitation. No one spoke without permission. The waitstaff moved like ghosts, trained to see nothing, hear nothing, remember nothing. The men who gathered around Tae-hwan's corner table understood the rules without needing them explained. Rule 1. You speak only when addressed. Rule 2. You never ask questions. Rule 3. You leave your emotions at the door, because sentiment is the crack that brings down empires. Tae-hwan embodied these rules like they were written into his DNA. At 38, he wore power the way other men wore cologne, effortlessly, suffocatingly. His black suit was tailored to perfection. His hair slicked back without a strand out of place. The dragon tattoo that coiled up his neck was the only hint of the violence that lived beneath his controlled exterior. When he looked at you, his eyes were winter itself, beautiful, merciless, and utterly empty of warmth. Tonight's meeting was routine. A real estate developer who'd gotten greedy needed to be reminded of their arrangement. A rival gang in Itaewon was testing boundaries that shouldn't be crossed. A politician who'd forgotten who really controlled the city council needed a gentle course correction. Tae-hwan listened to each report with the focus of a chess master, moving pieces across a board only he could fully see. His second-in-command, Kim Min-jae, sat to his right, loyal as a shadow, sharp as a blade. Around them, 6 other men represented different territories, different operations, different streams of revenue that all flowed back to the same source. They spoke in code, in numbers, in carefully chosen words that meant everything and nothing at once. The Itaewon situation requires a firm response, Min-jae said, his voice low and even. They've been collecting from 3 of our establishments without authorization. Tae-hwan swirled the whiskey in his glass, watching the amber liquid catch the light. Then they've forgotten who owns the night in this city. His voice was silk over steel, soft enough to draw you close, sharp enough to cut when you got there. Remind them. Quietly. I don't want this to become a story. Min-jae nodded. That was all it took. No threats, no elaboration necessary. In Tae-hwan's world, a nod was a verdict, and verdicts were always carried out. The conversation moved to financial reports, shipping schedules, political leverage. Tae-hwan processed it all with mechanical efficiency, his face an unreadable mask. This was how he'd survived for 15 years at the top of a world that devoured weak men for breakfast. No attachments. No vulnerabilities. No soft spots where a knife could slip between the ribs. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, in blood and ash and the screams that still echoed in his nightmares. His wife, his daughter, gone because he'd been stupid enough to love them, foolish enough to believe that a man like him could have a family without painting a target on their backs. The rival faction that took them had wanted to send a message. They'd succeeded. The message was received, and Tae-hwan had spent the last 8 years making sure everyone understood his response. Nothing and no one gets close enough to hurt me again. Around the lounge, other tables conducted their own quiet business. Everyone here existed in the same ecosystem. Predators who'd learned to coexist through mutual respect and carefully maintained boundaries. The unspoken rules kept the peace. Break them and you didn't get a second chance. Tae-hwan took another sip of whiskey, feeling the burn slide down his throat. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Seoul sprawled in every direction, a city of 10 million souls, and he controlled more of them than most would ever know. That's when the doors exploded open. The sound was wrong. All wrong. In a place like the Azure Lotus, doors didn't slam. They whispered open and closed with hydraulic precision, controlled and soundless. But these doors crashed against their frames like thunder, and suddenly every conversation in the room died mid-sentence. Tae-hwan's hand moved instinctively toward his waist, where a gun rested in its holster. Around him his men tensed, chairs scraping back, bodies coiling for violence. Min-jae was already on his feet, hand inside his jacket. The two guards who were supposed to be stationed outside stumbled through the doorway, faces flushed with panic and confusion. And between them, impossibly small and impossibly brave, ran a child. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old. Her pink dress was torn at the shoulder, one sleeve hanging by threads. Dark stains, blood, Tae-hwan's mind catalogued automatically, smeared across the fabric and streaked her bare legs. Her hair was a wild tangle around her face, and that face was a portrait of pure terror. Tears carved clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. Her breathing came in ragged, desperate gasps. She should have been stopped. She should have been impossible to get this far. But somehow this tiny, broken thing had crashed through every layer of security that surrounded Tae-hwan's world, driven by something more powerful than fear of consequences. The guards reached for her. "Sir, we're sorry," she just. "Stop." Tae-hwan's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Everyone froze. His eyes locked onto the girl, and for the first time in 8 years, something shifted behind the ice. Recognition, perhaps. Or memory. Or the ghost of a feeling he'd thought he'd buried with his daughter. The girl's eyes swept the room wild and searching, until they landed on him. And in that moment something passed between them, a kind of understanding that transcended logic. Maybe it was the way he sat at the center of everything, the obvious axis around which this world rotated. Maybe it was pure instinct, the way a drowning person knows to reach for the strongest swimmer. Or maybe she simply saw what everyone else had learned to fear, power. She ran straight toward him. Min-jae moved to intercept, but Tae-hwan raised his hand, that same small gesture that had ended careers and started wars. Min-jae stopped. The girl didn't. She stumbled between the tables, past men who'd killed for lesser disruptions, her small hands outstretched like she was reaching for salvation itself. When she grabbed his sleeve, Tae-hwan felt the tremor in her fingers, felt the dampness of blood and tears soaking through the expensive fabric of his suit, felt something crack in the fortress he'd built around his heart. "Please." Her voice was raw, shredded from screaming or crying or both. "Please, you have to help. They're hurting my mama. They're killing her. Please, please, please." The words tumbled out in a desperate flood, Korean mixed with sobs, barely coherent but devastatingly clear. Tae-hwan stared down at her. This small shaking thing that had somehow breached every defense, broken every rule, shattered the careful order of his world. Her eyes were wide and dark and full of a hope that felt obscene in this place where hope went to die. "Please save my mama." The room was a photograph frozen in time. Every man present understood that they were witnessing something that shouldn't be possible. A child touching the Dragon of Gangnam, speaking to him without permission, demanding something of him when grown men knew better than to ask for anything. The violation was so complete, so total that no one knew how to respond. Tae-hwan should have been angry, should have felt the cold fury that usually greeted anyone foolish enough to disrupt his business, should have gestured for the guards to remove her, gently or otherwise, and return to the matters at hand. But all he could see was another little girl in another pink dress, laughing in a garden that no longer existed. All he could hear was his daughter's voice saying "Appa" one last time before the world turned to fire and screaming. All he could feel was this child's desperate grip on his arm, so small, so fragile, so full of a faith that someone, anyone, might be strong enough to stop the monsters. His jaw tightened. The muscle in his cheek twitched once. When he spoke, his voice was still controlled, still measured, but something had changed in it. Something human had crept back in. "Where is your mother?" The girl's sob of relief was the loudest sound in the silent room. The girl's words spilled out in a torrent. An address in Mapogu. Men with bats, her mother's flower shop. Debts that weren't real, her mother screaming. Tae-hwan listened with the focus of a man reading a death warrant. But part of him wasn't in the Azure Lotus anymore. Part of him was 8 years in the past, standing in the ruins of everything he'd ever loved. Her name had been Yoon Ji-woo, his wife. She'd been a college literature professor, the kind of woman who believed in the fundamental goodness of people despite all evidence to the contrary. When they'd met, Tae-hwan was already deep in the life, already building his empire on blood and fear. She'd known what he was and loved him anyway, convinced that somewhere beneath the violence was a man worth saving. Their daughter, Seo, had her mother's smile and her father's stubborn will. 5 years old, with pigtails that were always slightly crooked and a laugh that could light up the darkest corners of Tae-hwan's world. She'd called him Appa with such absolute trust, such unshakable faith that he could fix anything, protect anyone, keep the monsters at bay forever. He'd been wrong to let them believe it. Wrong to think he could keep them separate from his world. As if love could be a sanctuary when power made you a target. The Bakshan faction had been challenging his territory for months, testing boundaries, looking for weakness. They'd found it in the two people who made him human. The attack came on a Tuesday afternoon. Tae-hwan had been across the city, meeting with politicians who needed reminding about their obligations. Ji-woo was picking Seo up from kindergarten. The car bomb was professionally done. Remote detonation, shape charge, designed to leave no survivors and a very clear message. By the time Tae-hwan arrived at the scene, there was nothing left but twisted metal and flames, and the smell of burning rubber mixed with something worse. He'd stood there in his expensive suit, surrounded by sirens and chaos and the concerned faces of his men, and felt something inside him die with them. Not just grief, grief was too small a word for the hollowness that opened up in his chest. It was the death of the part of him that believed in anything beyond survival. The part that hoped. The part that loved. The retaliation had been surgical and absolute. Within a week, the Bakshan faction ceased to exist. Not scattered, not defeated, erased. Every member, every associate, every person who'd known about the plan and said nothing, Tae-hwan had supervised personally, watching each one understand what it cost to take something from the Dragon of Gangnam. But vengeance hadn't filled the hole. Nothing could. So he'd built walls instead. Emotional architecture more impenetrable than any fortress. He dismissed the handful of staff who'd worked at his home, the ones who'd known Ji-woo and Seo, because their pity was unbearable. He'd moved into a sterile penthouse apartment that held no memories, no photographs, no evidence that he'd ever been anything but what he was now, a man made of ice and calculation. His men learned quickly not to mention family, not to speak of wives or children or anything that suggested the world contained anything softer than the deals they made and the territories they controlled. Sentiment became the unforgivable sin in his organization. You could be brutal, you could be ruthless, you could be anything except vulnerable. For 8 years it had worked. Tae-hwan had become more powerful, more feared, more successful than ever. The empire expanded. Rivals either bent the knee or disappeared. Politicians took his calls. Police looked the other way. He was untouchable, unreachable. A legend whispered about in the darkest corners of Seoul's underworld. But he was also alone. Profoundly, completely alone in a way that went beyond physical isolation. He'd murdered the part of himself that could connect, could care, could see another human being as anything more than an asset or a threat. It was the price of safety, the cost of never being hurt again. And now this child stood before him, her small hand clutching his sleeve, her eyes full of the same desperate faith that Seo had once placed in him. The same belief that Appa could fix anything, could stop the monsters, could make the world safe again. Tae-hwan felt the crack in his armor widen. Felt 8 years of carefully constructed numbness threatening to shatter under the weight of a 7-year-old's tears. He could send her away. Should send her away. One word and his men would handle this situation quietly, professionally, without his involvement. But Seo's ghost whispered in his ear, and his wife's memory touched his heart, and the walls he'd built suddenly felt less like protection and more like a prison. Min-jae. His voice was steady, but something in it made his second-in-command straighten. Get the car. The black Mercedes cut through Seoul's rain-slick streets like a knife through silk. Tae-hwan sat in the back, the girl pressed against his side, still trembling, still crying softly into her hands. He'd draped his suit jacket over her shoulders, too large, drowning her small frame, but she clutched it like a lifeline. Min-jae drove with the focused intensity of a man who understood that every second mattered, weaving through traffic with practiced precision. The address led them to a narrow street in Mapogu, one of the older neighborhoods where Seoul's relentless modernization hadn't quite reached. Small shops with hand-painted signs lined the cramped sidewalks. Street vendors packed up their carts as the rain began to fall harder. This was working-class Seoul, where people lived paycheck to paycheck and kept their heads down when trouble came calling. The flower shop was easy to spot. Its front window was shattered, glass glittering across the wet pavement like scattered diamonds. The wooden door hung crooked on its hinges. Even from the street, Tae-hwan could see the destruction inside. Overturned buckets, trampled flowers, soil scattered across the floor like evidence of a massacre. But it was the crowd that told the real story. 20, maybe 30 people stood in the rain, their umbrellas creating a canopy of black and clear plastic. They weren't watching with the detached curiosity of strangers. These were neighbors, friends, people who knew the woman inside and were too afraid to intervene, too powerless to stop what was happening. The girl, Seo Tae-hwan, she'd whispered her name during the drive, tried to bolt from the car the moment it stopped. Tae-hwan caught her gently but firmly. Stay here with Min-jae. But my mama. I'll bring her to you. He said it with such absolute certainty that the girl actually stopped struggling. That faith again. That terrible, beautiful faith that he could fix anything. He stepped out into the rain. Didn't bother with an umbrella. Let the water soak into his shirt, his hair, washing away the careful perfection he always maintained. The crowd parted instinctively as he approached, recognizing something in the way he moved, the predator's grace, the aura of barely contained violence that marked him as different from them. Inside the shop, the carnage was worse. What had once been someone's livelihood, someone's dream, lay in ruins. Ceramic vases smashed against the walls. Roses and lilies and chrysanthemums crushed underfoot, their petals bruised and dying. A small desk in the corner had been overturned, papers and receipts scattered everywhere. On the wall, a child's drawing hung crooked. A stick figure family holding hands under a smiling sun. Seo Tae-hwan's artwork, preserved behind cracked glass. And in the center of it all, collapsed against an overturned refrigerator unit, was the mother. She was younger than Tae-hwan expected, maybe early 30s. Her face was swollen, one eye already turning purple. Blood trickled from her split lip and matted her hair. Her floral apron was torn, revealing bruises that were just beginning to bloom across her ribs. She was conscious barely, her breath coming in shallow, pained gasps. 3 men stood over her. Young, arrogant, wearing leather jackets and sporting the kind of cheap swagger that came from bullying people weaker than themselves. One held a metal bat, still dripping with rain and probably blood. Another was going through the cash register, pocketing the few bills inside. The third was lecturing the broken woman at his feet. Told you last week. Interest compounds daily. You think you can just ignore us? You think just because you're a single mother, you get special treatment. He punctuated his words with a kick to her side. She whimpered but didn't scream. Maybe she had no screams left. They didn't notice Tae-hwan at first. Too focused on their victim, too drunk on the power that came from hurting someone defenseless. It was the silence from the street that finally made them turn. The sudden hush that fell over the crowd as they recognized what was about to happen. Tae-hwan stood in the doorway, water dripping from his hair. His white shirt plastered to his body, his expression utterly empty. But his eyes, those winter eyes that had watched empires crumble and men beg for mercy, held something that made the three thugs freeze. Gentlemen. His voice was conversational, almost pleasant. I believe you're conducting business in my city without proper authorization. The one with the bat tried to laugh, but it came out strangled. Your city? Old man, do you know who we work for? We're with the Yongsan crew. We collect where we're told to collect. Now get lost before. He didn't finish the sentence. Tae-hwan moved. The bat clattered to the floor before the thug even realized Tae-hwan had taken it from him. One moment it was in his hands, the next it was spinning across the wet tiles, and the thug was on his knees, his wrist bent at an angle that made the crowd outside gasp. Tae-hwan hadn't raised his voice, hadn't broken a sweat. The violence was surgical, efficient, over before it began. The other two reached for weapons, one a knife, the other reaching into his jacket, but Min-jae was already there, having followed his boss inside with the silent inevitability of a shadow. Two precise movements and both men were face down on the floor, arms wrenched behind their backs, breathing hard into the trampled flowers. Tae-hwan crouched beside the mother, his trained eye cataloging injuries with practiced efficiency. Broken ribs certainly. Possible internal bleeding. Concussion. The kind of beating designed to send a message, to break spirit as much as bone. She tried to focus on him through her good eye, confused, afraid, probably wondering if this was another nightmare in a night full of them. Your daughter sent me, he said quietly. Her expression crumbled, fresh tears mixing with the blood on her face. Relief and terror in equal measure. He pulled out his phone, speed dialing a number that only a handful of people in Seoul possessed. It rang once before a crisp, professional voice answered. Yes, Seo Gangnam? Dr. Kong. I need a full medical team at. He glanced at the ruined shop around him. Send them to Seoul Medical Center. Private wing. Trauma suite. I'm bringing someone who needs immediate care. Broken ribs, head trauma, internal injuries. I want your best people ready when we arrive. Of course. How long? 20 minutes. He ended the call and immediately dialed another number. Young. I need a clean vehicle at my location. Something with enough room to transport someone lying down. 5 minutes. The efficiency was breathtaking. This was Tae-hwan's real power. Not just violence but resources. The ability to mobilize an entire infrastructure with a few phone calls. To bend the city to his will through networks built over decades of careful cultivation. He shrugged off his already soaked shirt and pressed it gently against the worst of the mother's bleeding wounds. She flinched, tried to pull away, but he spoke with the same calm certainty he'd used with her daughter. I'm going to get you to a hospital. The best doctors in Seoul. You're going to be fine. Seo-yun. Her voice was barely a whisper, thick with pain and fear. She's safe. In my car. Waiting for you. He paused, then added something he hadn't said to anyone in years. I promise. Min-jae had the three thugs lined up against the wall now, their faces pressed to the cracked plaster, their earlier arrogance replaced with genuine terror. They'd recognized him. Everyone in Seoul's underworld eventually learned to recognize the Dragon of Gangnam, and those who learned too late usually didn't get a chance to make the same mistake twice. Names, Tae-hwan said, not looking at them, still focused on keeping pressure on the mother's wounds. The words tumbled out in a panicked rush. Kim something. Park something. The third one couldn't even speak, just made strangled sounds of fear. Min-jae pulled out his phone, already texting the names to their intelligence network. Within minutes they'd have full dossiers. Addresses, families, every person they'd ever known. Every debt they owed. Every secret they'd tried to keep. A black SUV pulled up outside. Custom Mercedes with tinted windows and enough interior space to serve as a mobile medical unit. Young Ho, one of Tae-hwan's most trusted drivers, stepped out with an umbrella. 2 more men emerged, carrying a stretcher. Tae-hwan lifted the mother with surprising gentleness, mindful of her injuries. She weighed almost nothing, fragile as broken glass in his arms. The crowd parted again as he carried her out into the rain. Their faces a mixture of shock and awe and something approaching reverence. In a neighborhood where police rarely came and justice was a luxury they couldn't afford, they were witnessing something impossible, power being used to protect instead of destroy. As the medical team secured the mother in the back of the SUV, Tae-hwan returned to his Mercedes where Seo-yeon still waited, her small face pressed against the window. He opened the door and crouched to her eye level. "Your mother is hurt, but she's going to be okay. We're taking her to the best hospital in Seoul. You can ride with her." The girl threw her arms around his neck, sobbing into his shoulder. Tae-hwan stood there, this feared crime lord with a child clinging to him in the rain, and felt another crack spread through the walls around his heart. Behind him, in the ruined flower shop, Min-jae waited with 3 terrified men who were just beginning to understand that they'd made a catastrophic mistake. The Seoul Medical Center's private wing existed in a different universe from the chaos of public emergency rooms. Marble floors, soft lighting, doctors who moved with the unhurried confidence of people who were paid extremely well to be discreet. Dr. Kong met them at the entrance personally, his team already prepped and waiting. Within minutes, Seo-yeon's mother was being wheeled into surgery while the girls sat in a private waiting room, wrapped in a blanket, holding a cup of hot chocolate she wasn't drinking. Tae-hwan watched through the window as nurses checked her vitals and an older woman from the hospital staff sat beside her, speaking in soothing tones. The girl would be cared for. The mother would survive. He'd already arranged for the hospital bills to disappear, for a security detail to be posted outside the surgical wing, for every comfort that money could buy. Now came the other half of justice. Min-jae appeared at his elbow, phone in hand, expression grim. "We have everything." They moved to a small consultation room down the hall. Min-jae pulled up files on his tablet, photos, addresses, phone records, the complete digital footprint of 3 men who'd thought themselves untouchable. But it was the 4th file that made Tae-hwan's jaw tighten. "The debt was fabricated," Min-jae reported, his voice flat and professional. "Lee Sun-hee, the mother, never borrowed anything from the Yongsan crew. Her husband died 2 years ago. Liver cancer. She's been running the flower shop alone ever since, barely making ends meet but never missing rent." He swiped to another screen. 3 weeks ago, a man named Choi Dae-young approached her claiming her dead husband owed them money. 50 million won, with interest compounding daily. When she said there was no such debt, they gave her 2 weeks to pay or face consequences. Tae-hwan's expression didn't change, but Min-jae had worked for him long enough to recognize the deadly stillness that meant someone had made a terminal mistake. "The 3 from tonight are low-level enforcers," Min-jae continued. "But Choi Dae-young is the one running the scheme. He's been targeting single mothers and widows across 3 neighborhoods. Small business owners who can't fight back. He manufactures debts, collects what he can, and when they can't pay, he seizes their assets or..." He gestured toward the hospital wing where he was in surgery. "Makes examples." "Yongsan crew," Tae-hwan said quietly. "That's Park Min-suk's territory." "Yes. Park's been expanding aggressively the last 6 months, muscling into areas he has no authorization to operate in. This debt collection scheme is just one operation. Our sources say he's been bragging about it in the clubs. Calls it harvesting the weak." The words hung in the air like poison. In the complex hierarchy of Seoul's underworld, there were rules. Brutal rules perhaps, but rules nonetheless. You didn't prey on civilians without cause. You didn't fabricate debts. You didn't beat women half to death over money they never borrowed. These weren't just crimes, they were violations of the order that kept the entire system from collapsing into chaos. More importantly, Park Min-suk was operating in neighborhoods that fell under Tae-hwan's protection, whether the residents knew it or not. The flower shop sat 3 blocks from a building Tae-hwan owned. The street where he struggled to raise her daughter alone was territory he'd controlled for 15 years. This wasn't just about one woman. It was about a rival faction deliberately testing his boundaries, seeing if the Dragon of Gangnam had grown soft, if his reputation was enough to protect his territory, or if he'd let challenges slide. "Where is Park now?" Tae-hwan asked. Min-jae checked his phone. His usual Thursday night routine. Private room at Club Meridian in Itaewon. He's there with 8 of his inner circle. Our contact says they've been drinking for hours, celebrating tonight's collection numbers. Celebrating. They were celebrating the beating of a defenseless woman, laughing over stolen money and fabricated debts, while a 7-year-old girl cried into a stranger's jacket. Tae-hwan looked back toward the waiting room where Seo-yeon sat, small and traumatized and trusting that the man she'd grabbed in desperation would make things right. He thought of Min-seo, of the daughter he'd failed to protect, of the promise he'd made to himself after her death, never again. Never let anyone hurt the innocent on his watch. He'd broken that promise by building walls, by retreating into ice and isolation, by convincing himself that not caring was the same as staying safe. "Gather the team," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a verdict. "All of them. And find me the location of every person in Park's organization who knew about this debt collection scheme." Min-jae smiled, thin and cold. "How many cars?" "All of them." Club Meridian pulsed with bass and neon. A 3-story monument to excess where Seoul's nouveau riche paid obscene cover charges for the privilege of being seen. But the real business happened in the private rooms upstairs, where soundproofing and discretion came standard and questions were never asked about what occurred behind closed doors. Park Min-suk held court in the largest suite, surrounded by his inner circle like a king among lesser nobles. Bottles of premium liquor covered the table. Women in designer dresses perched on leather couches, paid to laugh at jokes that weren't funny and admire men who weren't admirable. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the particular arrogance that came from believing yourself untouchable. Park was in his mid-40s, barrel-chested and loud, the kind of man who compensated for mediocre intelligence with excessive brutality. He'd clawed his way up through Yongsan's ranks by being willing to do things others hesitated at, and now he sat at the top of his small empire, convinced that fear was the same thing as respect. 50 million from that flower shop bitch," he was saying to general laughter from his crew. "Can you believe she actually thought she could refuse? Said her husband never borrowed anything." He mimicked a woman's voice, high and mocking. "Please sir, there must be a mistake." More laughter. So Young-ho and the boys had to educate her on how debt collection works in the real world. The door to the private room opened. Not a knock, not a request for entry. Just the door swinging wide with the hydraulic smoothness of hinges that had been recently oiled. The music from the club beyond faded as the threshold was crossed, replaced by a silence that felt heavy enough to crush. Tae-hwan walked in alone. Behind him, the doorway filled with shadows, 12 of his best men, blocking the only exit. They didn't draw weapons. Didn't need to. Their presence was threat enough. The laughter died. The women stopped pretending to smile. Park's inner circle, 8 men who'd been comfortable 30 seconds ago, now looked like they wanted to dissolve into the furniture. Because everyone in this room knew who'd just walked in. Everyone understood what it meant when Seo Tae-hwan came calling unannounced. Park tried to recover, rising from his seat with forced joviality. "Tae-hwan SSI. This is unexpected. If I'd known you were coming, I would have." "Sit down." 2 words spoken quietly, but Park dropped back into his chair like his legs had been cut out from under him. Tae-hwan moved to the table, his eyes scanning the bottles, the money scattered carelessly across the surface, the general atmosphere of celebration. He picked up one of the bottles, 30-year scotch, probably 3 million won, and examined the label with academic interest. "Tell me, Park. What are we celebrating tonight?" Park's smile was starting to crack around the edges. "Just business. You know how it is. Good week, good earnings. Good earnings. Tae-hwan set the bottle down with exquisite care. From where, specifically? Various operations. Collections, protection fees, the usual. From widows and single mothers. Tae-hwan's voice remained conversational, but something in it made the temperature in the room plummet. From fabricated debts and invented obligations. From women who can't defend themselves in neighborhoods that aren't yours to operate in. Park's face flushed red. Around him, his men were trying to decide whether to reach for weapons or run. The women were already edging toward the corners of the room, instincts telling them to be anywhere else. Now wait a minute. Those collections are legitimate business. Tae-hwan moved faster than a man his size should be able to move. One moment he was across the table, the next his hand was fisted in Park's collar, hauling him forward until their faces were inches apart. The bottle of scotch fell, spilling liquid gold across the table and onto the floor. No one moved to catch it. You beat a woman half to death tonight, Tae-hwan said, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. In front of her 7-year-old daughter. Over a debt that never existed. In my territory. Do you understand what you've done? Park tried to pull away, but Tae-hwan's grip was iron. Your territory? The Mapo district isn't. All of Seoul is my territory. The words were absolute, undeniable. Every street, every shop, every person trying to live their life without being destroyed by parasites like you. You forgot that. You forgot who actually runs this city. He released Park with enough force to send him stumbling back into his chair. Around the room, Park's men sat frozen, hands carefully visible away from weapons. They'd already done the math. 12 of Tae-hwan's crew against 8 of theirs. But numbers didn't matter when facing the Dragon of Gangnam. Tae-hwan circled the table slowly, his footsteps the only sound in the suffocating silence. He picked up a stack of bills from the scattered money, thumbed through it with casual contempt, then tossed it back down. Here's what's going to happen, he said, addressing the room but keeping his eyes on Park. Every woman, every small business owner, every family you've targeted with your fabricated debt scheme, you're going to return every one you've taken. With interest. 50% on top of what you stole. Park's face went from red to white. That's millions. We don't have that kind of. Then you'll sell assets. Property, cars, whatever you need to liquidate. You have 72 hours. Tae-hwan continued his slow circuit of the room. The 3 men who put their hands on Lee Sun-hee tonight are already in custody. My custody. They'll be dealt with appropriately. One of Park's lieutenants, younger and more foolish than the others, started to rise. You can't just. Min-jae moved from the doorway, and the lieutenant sat back down so fast his chair scraped against the floor. The message was clear. Interrupting was a poor survival strategy. Your operation in Mapo, Yongsan and Sia-Demon districts ends tonight, Tae-hwan continued. You will withdraw all personnel, cease all collections, and never step foot in those neighborhoods again. Any property you own there, you'll sell to buyers I designate at fair market value. Any ongoing contracts or protection arrangements you have, you'll transfer to my organization. Park's jaw worked soundlessly. This wasn't just a punishment. It was dismemberment. Tae-hwan was carving away a third of his territory, stripping him of his most profitable operations, reducing him from a significant player to a minor operator struggling to survive. And the debt collection scheme, Tae-hwan said, finally stopping directly in front of Park again. Not just yours. Every crew running similar operations in Seoul gets the same message. We're done preying on civilians who can't fight back. We're done inventing obligations and terrorizing families. There are rules to this life and you've forgotten them. Rules. Park found his voice, though it came out strangled. Since when do you care about rules? You built your empire on. The slap was open-handed but carried enough force to snap Park's head sideways. Not theatrical, not meant for show. Just a measured correction, the kind you'd give a dog that had soiled the carpet. I built my empire on power, Tae-hwan said quietly. Real power. Not the fake strength that comes from beating defenseless women. Not the illusion of control you get from terrorizing people who can't strike back. He leaned down, his face inches from Park's again. A 7-year-old girl walked into a room full of dangerous men tonight because she had nowhere else to turn. Because people like you have convinced this city that there's no justice, no protection. No one who'll stand between predators and prey. That ends now. He straightened, addressing the entire room. Every person in Park's organization has a choice. Walk away clean tonight, find legitimate work, and you'll never hear from me again. Or continue this path and understand that I'll be watching. Every move, every scheme, every time you think about squeezing money from someone who can't afford to lose it. The room remained silent. These were hard men, most of them accustomed to violence and casual cruelty. But there were levels to this world, hierarchies that everyone understood. Park had been a regional power. Tae-hwan was something else entirely. The storm that other storms measured themselves against. The 3 men from tonight, Park managed, his voice thick. What? What are you going to do with them? That's not your concern anymore. Tae-hwan moved toward the door. Min-jae and the others stepped aside to let him pass. You have 72 hours for the restitution payments. My people will contact you with account details and a list of every victim you owe. Miss the deadline, and this conversation becomes significantly less civil. He paused in the doorway, looking back one final time. And Park? If I hear about you or your people operating anywhere near Mapogu again, if I hear about one more fabricated debt or one more widow being intimidated, I won't come to talk next time. There won't be a negotiation. There won't be a warning. There will just be consequences. Are we clear? Park nodded, the movement small and defeated. The king of his small castle had been reminded that castles meant nothing when faced with an empire. Tae-hwan walked out of Club Meridian with his men falling into formation around him. The bass from the club resumed, life continuing its mindless rhythm. But something fundamental had shifted in Seoul's underworld tonight. Word would spread. The Dragon of Gangnam had drawn a new line, and everyone would adjust accordingly. Because that's what you did when gods redefined the rules. 3 months later, spring arrived in Seoul with the kind of aggressive beauty that made the city feel reborn. Cherry blossoms lined the streets in clouds of pink and white. The air lost its winter edge, turning soft and forgiving. In Honggang Park, families spread blankets on the grass while children chased each other in dizzy circles, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Tae-hwan sat on a bench near the riverside path, watching a small girl in a yellow sundress feed ducks at the water's edge. Her mother stood nearby, one hand resting protectively on her daughter's shoulder, the other holding a paper bag of breadcrumbs. Lee-sun, he had recovered well. The bruises had faded, the broken ribs had healed, and the fear in her eyes had been replaced with something cautiously resembling peace. The flower shop had reopened 6 weeks after the attack. New windows, fresh paint, a security system that would make a bank jealous. All paid for by an anonymous benefactor that Sun-hee had stopped questioning. Her debt had been publicly cleared, with written confirmation delivered by certified mail. The 3 men who'd beaten her had disappeared from Seoul entirely. Rumor said they'd found work in fishing boats near Busan, far from the city and any temptation to return to their old ways. Park Min-suk's entire operation had been systematically dismantled. The restitution payments had been made, every fabricated debt erased, every stolen one returned with interest. The neighborhoods he'd terrorized were now under different management. Tae-hwan's management, though the residents would never know it. Protection that actually protected. Order that didn't require bleeding the innocent. Seo-yeon spotted him and broke away from her mother, running across the grass with the boundless energy of a child who'd learned that nightmares eventually end. She crashed into his legs with enough force to make him grunt, wrapping her small arms around his knees. "Ah, Juicy, you came." He'd asked her not to call him that. It made him sound old. But she'd compromised by calling him Tae-hwan Juicy instead, which somehow felt like both a victory and a defeat. He reached down and lifted her onto the bench beside him, producing a small paper bag from his coat pocket. "Honey butter chips," she announced reverently. tearing into the bag with the single-minded focus that children brought to their favorite snacks. Mama says I can only have these on special occasions. And what's the occasion? You're here. She said it with such simple certainty, such absolute faith that his presence alone made a day special, that Tae-hwan felt something warm and painful move through his chest. Son, he approached more slowly, her smile tentative but genuine. You didn't have to come all this way. I was nearby. A lie. His penthouse was across the city, and he'd cleared his entire afternoon to be here. But some truths were easier delivered as fiction. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the river flow past and the city sparkle in the afternoon sun. Seo-yeon chattered about school, about the new flowers in her mother's shop, about a boy in her class who'd pulled her hair and how she'd kicked him in the shin in retaliation. Son, he tried to look disapproving but couldn't quite manage it. She's become fearless, son, he said quietly when Seo-yeon ran off to chase a butterfly. After everything that happened, I thought she'd be traumatized. But instead she's braver. Like she learned that even when the world is terrifying, there are people who'll stand up for you. Tae-hwan didn't respond immediately. He watched the girl dancing through the grass, completely unaware that the man on the bench had killed people, destroyed lives, built an empire on fear and calculated violence. To her, he was just the person who'd helped when no one else would. The person who'd kept his promise. I thought I was protecting myself, he said finally, surprising himself with the confession. After my family died, I thought if I never cared about anyone, never let anyone close, I'd be safe. Turns out I was just alone. Son, he studied him with the kind of insight that came from surviving her own darkness. And now, he watched Seo-yeon spin in circles, arms outstretched, head thrown back in pure joy. Now I think maybe the smallest hands carry the greatest power. A child decides to trust a stranger, and suddenly that stranger has to decide if he's the kind of man worthy of that trust. Are you? The question hung in the spring air. 3 months ago, he would have said no without hesitation, would have maintained that sentiment was weakness, that caring was the crack that brought down empires, that the only way to survive in his world was to become something harder than the darkness around him. But a 7-year-old girl had grabbed his sleeve and shattered 8 years of carefully constructed armor with 5 words. Please save my mama. If this story made you feel something, like the video and subscribe for more.